Well, hello, students. This is going to be a two-part online lecture for our class this term. I'm going to be talking about Willa Cather and Zora Neale Hurston, and really kind of more generally early 20th century fiction. Didn't have a chance very much when we introduced Chopin to talk much about the literary movement that she was part of. I'm going to do that here, and I'm going to talk about Willa Cather, and then we're going to do a second part that's going to bring up Zora Neale Hurston, and particularly a little bit of the Harlem Renaissance. Now, you can do an entire course on each of the two movements that these writers were part of, the realism movement and the Harlem Renaissance, and courses have been done on them in the past, and so we can just skim the surface is all, just trying to put the literary works into some context. What happened after the American Civil War is that a lot of writers, particularly fiction writers, who had, by the way, a background in journalism, many of them, were interested in writing a different type of fiction than what prevailed prior to the Civil War. What prevailed prior to the Civil War, things like The Scarlet Letter and Moby Dick and a lot of the other stuff that was either gothic or it was romantic in style or melodramatic in style, and I'll refer back to that here in a moment. It was something that the writers after the Civil War just didn't have a great interest in. They wanted to write a different type of fiction, and that was influenced largely by their life experiences and what was going on culturally. To some extent, what was going on in Europe, because there were some European writers who were also dabbling with a new type of fiction. And we call this fiction realism for several reasons. One, the fiction emphasized verisimilitude, meaning they wanted the action in the novel, the plot of the novel, the characters, everything about the novel, to be as much like real life as possible. You've probably noticed that in earlier 19th century or 18th century even fiction, people don't always act the way normal people would. It's a little bit more gallant and romantic. The language is a little bit more lofty. The circumstances that happen are a little bit more coincidental. These guys were saying, we just want to paint pictures of real life, the way life really is. We don't want to carry into it any preconceived notions. By the way, the invention of photography served as a really interesting artistic metaphor for these writers. They wanted their work as fiction writers to reflect reality like a photograph would reflect reality. Now, there's always some subjectivity, if you ask any great photographer, in your choices as a photographer, what angle, what lighting, what shading, what perspective, though, all of those things, many, many different things. So it's not as though this is just absolutely objective, but the term objective is frequently used with these writers. Nothing is 100% objective when it comes to art, but they wanted to try to cultivate that sense of realism and objectivity, etc. And they did this through the diction and dialogue of their characters. They had, if you had somebody who was an uneducated person, you didn't make them sound like they had just finished at Oxford, for example. If you had somebody who was from the West, you wanted them to speak like they were from the West. From the Northeast, from the Northeast. Mark Twain, otherwise known as Samuel Clemens, was particularly good at this. He really was very keen on trying to depict people with the right dialect, and he prided himself, I should say, on being able to affect or present characters with accurate dialects and the proper diction. An emphasis on ordinary people. This was not, these guys started writing about not kings and queens and knights in shining armor and those kinds of things, or damsels in distress. They wanted to write about ordinary people, not necessarily just rich people. Sometimes rich people, yeah, but usually the ordinary struggles of ordinary people. And in that sense, realism was a movement that prided itself on sort of democratizing art in some ways. New country for the common person, and the art of that new country should be, in their eyes, should be geared towards the common person and their experiences. The big thing that really kind of separates it, I think, from romanticism or especially melodramatic fiction like we read with Charlotte Temple, is that there's no preconceived notion about social norms or anything like that. There's no set outcome, I should say. You start a pre-Civil War novel that's either romantic or whatever it is, and you know how it's supposed to end, right? A Jane Austen novel ends a certain way, right? They got to get married. It's got to be a happy ending on it, or it has to be a character who learns a valuable lesson, even if it's a tragedy. But whatever the novel does, or whatever the short story does, it has to make sure that it adheres to the kind of ending that was consistent with the dominant morality of the time. That's something that realists didn't want to do. They wanted to set their characters into motion, introduce them to circumstances, and they wanted the characters to behave the way they thought real life characters would behave, no matter what. Even if it ended up, here's this character who went through something terrible and there was no happy ending. Or here's this character who was a bad person and he got away with it. Or here's a person who was a really good person and died miserably anyway. This rubs us the wrong. We all want a good ending to a story, right? The realists were saying, yeah, but that's not what I'm going to give you. I'm going to give you life as I see it the way it is. And I'm not going to superimpose on top of that, some sort of preset outcome. Nor am I going to preach to you about, the dominant moral culture and how this character's bad because she does this character's good because he does that. There's really this attempt anyway to describe reality the way it is, not the way it should be. And so you see that a lot in here. So when you see Chopin, right, we read the story of an hour, this is hardly, romantic fiction, is it? When you kind of connect this to Charlotte Temple, which was pre-romantic, okay, it was the sentimental seduction tradition, but it was kind of an early melodramatic, I would call it melodrama. The gasping and the fainting and the crying and all of these kinds of things were really more melodramatic fiction. But it was clear that the author in that circumstance felt duty bound to directly address the readers about her moral intentions with the novel. And made sure that bad people didn't get away with stuff and good people got rewarded and all of those things. So the realists were just simply not interested in doing. The diction of the character seems a little stilted, a little stiff. It's like, does everybody talk like that? Probably not. And so the characters also were although I would say that they weren't totally sort of black and white, there were some shades of gray there. But for the most part, the goodies are the goodies and the baddies are the baddies, or at least the dummies are the dummies. That's for sure. And whether you're bad or dumb, you get the consequences of your actions. Realists would say, look, there are some people who do some bad things and no one ever finds out about it. And so there you have it. So anyway, moving on, I want to talk to you a little bit about Willa Cather's short story, Paul's Case, A Study in Temperament. And by the way, everybody always does this. I don't know why they do this, but they never give the full title of this piece. I'm going to move myself around here so I can not block things if I can. Yeah, here I go. No. Okay, I'm off now. The Paul's Case, A Study in Temperament. That's very important. Pay attention to the full title. It is a study, right? An examination in temperament. What is temperament? Temperament is more than just, it's a certain aspect of your personality, your overall personality, your temperament. His temperament he has a nervous temperament. He has an anxious temperament. He has a very placid temperament. When we talk about we're talking about an aspect of your personality. And so what kind of personality does he have? Well, it's pretty doggone unique. It's pretty difficult kind of to like the guy, but in some ways, I hope by the end of the story, you do feel some sense of sympathy. Now, it's very hard because some people read this and on the surface level, they say, this guy is just a really hard person to like. I mean, he just thinks he's so much better. He's so entitled to the beautiful things in life. And, the guy doesn't have two nickels to rub together, but he's still intent upon, even stealing and taking advantage of other people to do these things that he wants, to live this high life, to have this inflated and false notion of himself. I understand that. I really do understand the sort of visceral, I don't like this guy attitude that people have. But the most important thing, I think, is for you to realize that there is a way to at least cultivate an understanding of where he's coming from. He lives in a banal, boring neighborhood, and he lives a boring life, and he seems doomed or fated to live that way the rest of his life. Even the neighborhood where he lives, where everybody has the same house all in a row, and they all have the same front porch or stoop. And everybody expects you to just get this boring job and live a boring life and marry a boring person and have boring kids and then just die. There's something very unappealing about that. You can kind of understand that. And he's in an educational system that is just obey, don't think, don't be original, don't be creative, don't make trouble. It's very authoritarian. It's very repressive. It's very oppressive. You can't be yourself kind of thing. So the question I have is, why present this character to us? All authors have the ability to choose their subject matter, obviously, and to paint a character the way they want. Sometimes they're inspired by real life, sometimes just their own imagination. Why does he matter? What is Cather do? And I'm not going to answer this question for you. I want you to answer that question. Why do you think Cather presents us this guy? I mean, of all the people that you could present, this guy, what's so interesting about him? I would submit to you that she has a really good point in implicitly saying to us, this is an interesting person. Pay attention to this kid's life. Why? Because maybe it's a comment on our society right now, how not everybody fits into a certain preset mold, how some people have different temperaments than others, right? They're just born with a different kind of set of personality traits, and you say, well, but he stole and he did all that. Yes, I know, I understand that. He also, please understand that he's 16 or 17 or whatever, and he's not really a fully mature adult yet. Okay, people make mistakes when they're younger, etc. So I'm trying to build the case for having a little bit of understanding and sympathy. And by the way, realism will present you with a character like that, right? As Mary Wilkins Freeman's the Story of an Hour will present you with a character who is really kind of this mixture of good qualities and not so great qualities, or at least you don't know how to feel about the fact that she's kind of happy her husband died. Not really happy. I wouldn't say happy, but you see how that's very nuanced. It's not, here's a good character, here's a bad character, right? Instead, you've got a character like Louise who, she's complicated. She's complex. Okay. So is Paul. Give Paul give Paul the opportunity to get to know him as well. I'm not arguing for obviously some of his behavior. What I am arguing for is, where does he come from and why? Why is he the way he is? And then why does he matter? Why is he so different? So I want you to kind of think in ways of how can you find things to sympathize with him about, despite the fact that he does things he's not supposed to do. The easy thing would be to default and say, well, I'd like to live in a fancy hotel and eat caviar and champagne all day. Sure, but you can't do that. You got to get, okay, yeah. I understand that. On the other hand, what drove him to do it, right? I'm not trying to sympathize with somebody based on bad decisions, but I am trying to understand why he would do it. Now, look also at this sort of the bipartite structure of the piece, which I think doesn't get anywhere near enough attention. The piece has two parts, right? There's before he leaves and then after he leaves for New York. Okay, so he grows up in Pittsburgh, and at that time, Pittsburgh was a very blue-collar, middle-class kind of working-class town, steel mills and things of this nature. And the struggle there would be for a middle-class family to try to stay out of the steel mills and to try to maintain some sort of white-collar, middle-class existence. If you've never seen what it's like or read what it's like to work in those steel mills and work it's a hard life these people had. Coal mines. I mean, it was really, life was, as the philosopher once said, nasty, brutish, and short for people like that. So, someone like Paul's father would indeed want his son to get a decent job for fear that he would have to go and work with his back. My parents always said that. They always said, I don't want you kids to have to work with your back, okay? Work with your brain, not with your back kind of thing. Because when they grew up in the Depression, it was really, really hard. They were surrounded by people who were sharecroppers and poor farmers, poor dirt farmers. And they wanted us to go to school and do well because they were concerned about where we might end up in terms of work. So anyway, that's a different story. But you can see that coming through with Paul's father. He's very serious and intent on Paul doing something with himself. But Paul, of course, can't stand the way his school is set up, the way it's structured in terms of its authority, and he comes across really odd. Most of his teachers see him as being flippant and sarcastic and full of himself, which he kind of is. But have you ever met anybody who you think, is that guy being a jerk, or is he just kind of awkward? You know, is he being sarcastic with me, or does he really not know how to have a conversation? I've known people like that who my first impression was, who is this smart aleck? Or why is this person not taking my conversation with him seriously? But then you get to know them a bit and you say, okay, there's something a little different about this person. Now, 1905, when this is first published, I mean, the date on it in the text is 1909, but it was actually published earlier than 1909. People knew nothing about, for example, the autism spectrum. Didn't know that. I don't know whether that's what's going on here with Paul or not. I have no idea. People didn't know very much and didn't have a lot of tolerance for people whose personalities were just a little different. I once worked with a graduate student who had Asperger's. He was very open about it, and we did well together, and I helped him through his professional paper. He was a brilliant young man, had gone to Stanford, had gotten 3 degrees, and was finishing the one that we were working on here at TWU. But I found it very, very challenging to work with him simply because he just operated differently in terms of conversation. To have a conversation about his writing was a real challenge because he just approached things with a different sort of reality than I did. But we made it. It was fine, but it was a learning process, I think, for both of us. And so you may have met somebody who is just like, why is he the way he is? Now, when you're little, you're like, that kid's weird, right? But when you get older, you realize, well, now, okay, everyone's a little different. That's why the subtitle is so important. Paul's Case, a study in temperament. Okay, a study in temperament. Why does she think he's worthy of being studied? Well, I mean, we'll get you to, and I'll invite you to talk about that in the discussion, perhaps. So the other thing too, I think that has brought some critical attention. I can't tell you, but there is some critical thought here among some scholars that what she's hinting at is that Paul is different in another way, and that is in terms of his sexuality. You'll notice that Paul never talks about girls or being interested in girls. And by the way, don't get too carried away with the fact that she uses a word or two here or there that maybe is hinting something. But don't give it too much credibility. Just take it in passing. I'll give you a couple of examples here, if I can find it. There is a point where someone says something about a cigarette, and it's referred to as a faggot. Okay, F-A-G-G-O-T, which today is considered a slur, obviously, but it's used in here. He burnt like a faggot in a temper. Okay, this is on page 507. Well, what is meant there, and I kind of read into it. What is meant there is a cigarette or a stick. Okay, because and today, by the way, in some parts of the UK, they'll say, "Hey, can I borrow a fag?" Right? Have you got an extra fag? And what they mean by that is a cigarette. And the term fag for cigarette comes from the term fag for stick, right? Sticks. Because people, and you can get into the etymology of all of this, do as you wish. But essentially the term fag or faggot meant stick or bundle of sticks. And some theorize that it got associated with homosexual people because of some sense of this person carrying something or doing something for being subservient to somebody else. And in the school system in the UK also, if you were like a senior, you had a junior who did your stuff for you. Okay, and that person was called your fag. There was no sense there of necessarily of homosexuality, but it was considered that this person was effeminate. or more, or you were more alpha than that person was. Okay, there's a whole thing in there. Did the term faggot, the pejorative sense of meaning homosexual, apply in 1905 or 1909? That's a great question. I think you should look into it. I don't know whether it did or not. Then later she says, the next page on 508, she says, Cordelia Street, a place where faggot-looking businessmen got on the early... And that is from the term to be fagged out, which means to be tired, okay? And that's another slang term that was used. Is she dropping those words in order to hint to us because in 1905 or 1909, she really couldn't bring up this directly for fear that the reader might feel more alienated from him because of certain prejudices at the time? I can't tell you. But I know that it is something that has caught the eye of a number of critics who is trying to tell you that Paul's case is a case or a study in his temperament, that Paul is struggling with his sexuality. He has a seeming infatuation with Charlie Edwards, and he has a sort of a one-day venture with some boy from Yale, which ends kind of not very pleasantly, abruptly, right? The boy gets in the elevator and they just say goodbye and it just ends. Is that because the boy read into it that Paul wanted something more than just a day's outing with this guy, that Paul had misread this person, that maybe Paul isn't even aware of his own sexuality? I don't know. I don't want to make this story... I don't want to make your focus in the story totally on Paul's sexuality, because there's something more to a person than their sexuality, obviously. However, it certainly is something that's going on here. The terms, like I said, that are being used, etc. But alternatively, maybe it's just a piece about the banality of life, that what is the point? If you're a person who's different and you come to a realization sometime after adolescence, going through the difficulty and trauma of adolescence, that you just don't fit in for whatever reason, whether it's your sexuality or whether it's your personality or whether it's, something about you that's kind of, neurologically different, whatever it is there room for someone who's different? Is there a way for that person to find happiness in the world other than what Paul chooses here, which is abject self-indulgence? And he steals and doesn't seem to have any remorse about it. That's the other thing. Remember, this marks it as part of that realism, almost modernism. It's getting close to the modernist movement, but at the turn of the century here, but certainly marks it as realistic, because there's no sense on his part that, well, I've done something terrible here and I have great moral remorse over it. I don't see that. I see concern that he's run out of money and there's nothing else to do. He's not thinking beyond the moment. He is a creature of his senses. He is a creature that wants beauty in his life, and he has none. Remember, Pittsburgh in the late 1800s, early 1900s was not a cheerful, happy, pretty place. It was a gritty, grimy, dark, coal dust covered industrial town where, your prospect of living a beautiful life and enjoying the beauty of nature and art and those kinds of things. He works in Carnegie Hall, and he gets exposure to great plays and symphonies and these kinds of things. He loves it, but he is ill-equipped to be part of that world. He just likes being there. He comes, I think, to the conclusion by the end of the novel that I was born in the wrong life. I should have been born a person who has the means to enjoy the finer things in life, because I really do enjoy them. But my circumstances don't allow it. Now, the tough person in you might say, well, then you ought to get a job and save your money so you can actually enjoy the finer things of life. That's what people do. They go and work hard and they establish themselves and they get rich, and then they can do that kind of stuff. And for whatever reason, Paul basically says, I can't do that. It'll kill me. It'll kill my soul to have to do that. And why can't I enjoy the finer things in life? Because if I can't, in his mind, it's not worth living. I understand that there are many of you who say, look, if I never went to another opera in my life, I wouldn't bother me. But there's a certain type of person who says, if I cannot experience the beauty of life, then I don't want to live, because it's just trolling me to offer it up. It's teasing me. It's cruelty to somebody who has the kind of temperament to enjoy and to appreciate art and beauty and then deprive them of it. It's as though the universe is playing a sick, cruel joke on me. So I'm just trying to get you to understand, you don't have to like every character that you write about if you're a writer. They may have very mixed feelings, but I don't want you to just be dismissive of the character, because maybe Paul is the only one in the novel, the short story, who has the courage to say, it's not fair that everyone cannot experience the great beauty of life, music and art and flowers and these things. Why can't I? Why am I fated to be the one who has to live an ugly, dirty, boring existence? Why me? Why do I have to do that? There are some of these schlubs over here who are going to these plays and drinking cocktails and things like this that have no appreciation whatsoever of their. And by the way, that you could say that's true today. That there are some people who are very poor who have a greater appreciation of the finer things in life, art and music and philosophy and food and all those kinds of things, than some of these rich people who act like, like I said, schlubs who basically, snarf down caviar without even appreciating what it is. There's nothing worse than classless rich people. And Paul, of course, is seeing some of this. And I think there's this disconnect in his mind about the fairness of it all. And why am I here if I have this longing and appreciation and desire for these things, but I'm fated never to be able to have them? What's the point of being around? Well, what I'll do is I'll experience it at least once, no matter what I have to do, no matter how short it is. I'm going to go and do it. Anyway, going to start part 2 of this lecture. The quiz will be over in part 2. Make sure that you watch it. I'm going to use Easter eggs rather than put it at the final slide. So you got to listen to the whole thing before you get all the quiz questions. Okay, we'll continue on with that one.